All right, it's 2:00. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Joyelle Mulheron. I'm the founder and executive director of Evermore. For many of you who are here today, you probably don't know of our organization. We do not focus the individual grief experience, unlike our expert here today, Megan. Yes, we are more focused on policies and systems change around bereavement and advancing the science. And each month we host monthly conversations with bereavement and grief experts. And this month we have Megan Devine, who for many of us, I think needs absolutely no introduction. When I think about Megan, I think of her as the OG of grief. She's been here, indeed, she has been here for a very long time. And for those of you who don't know Megan, you should, or I think you should. And so before I introduce her, I just want to say a couple of things. In advance of this, we asked people who were registering if they had any questions. So we got a lot of questions, and I'm concerned that we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to do the best that we can. But while we were soliciting questions from folks, these are some of the things that people said about you: that your work has become their Bible. They've read your book 12 times. You are what has kept them going, especially in the early months, and that you have been a lifeline for them and in their darkest times. And so I just wanted to share that with you, because some of what people were sharing with us was so profound and so meaningful and emotional and moving. And so you being the carrier of so many hearts in this world that are hurting and help people through those really dark times is just really profound. For us to even read and watch, to see what people are saying about you, about their hardships, and about their work. So everyone can be as wowed here as the fan base of Megan Devine. So Megan is a best-selling author, psychotherapist, and grief advocate with over 20 years in the field and deep personal experience of grief. She is the go-to authority for grievers, supporters, and industry professionals. Her pioneering work provides a professional, inclusive, and realistic approach to grief, one that goes far beyond the pathology-based and reductive models. Megan's book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, has sold over 250,000 copies, and my family has several, and it's available in 16 languages. New York Magazine's The Strategist named the book in their top 16 grief books recommended by psychologists in 2021. Her animated short, How to Help a Grieving Friend, has been viewed over 70 million times and is used in training programs around the world. She's been published in Psychology Today, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and has served as a grief expert for major media outlets, including NPR, iHeartRadio, and the PBS documentary Speaking Grief. Megan, thank you for being here. Really.
You're welcome. That's like the longest introduction ever when you go through all of the things.
All the things.
All the things. I feel like I want to disclose right from the top, everybody, that Joyelle and I are very good friends. So we might, even though we're talking about emotional and sometimes challenging things, you're probably going to hear us make some inside jokes at each other, because we actually spend a lot of time together, and she is one of my favorite people in the whole world. And when Joyelle said that you should get to know Evermore, I think one thing to know is that you will probably never interact with Evermore directly, but Joyelle's work is to create an organization that fights for grieving people everywhere. And I'm going to get choked up just talking about her, because I know a lot of you don't know the work that they're doing. But things like bereavement leave, right? And a national policy for bereavement leave. Joyelle's the one that's working to make that happen for people. So you probably will never know the work that they do, but you should know that they just do everything they can to make the suckage of grief the systems underneath the suckage of grief better for you and for your families. And she's just
thank you.
We just love her. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, in going into this, I thought to myself, okay, I shouldn't mention these things. Like, I have to separate that out. But no, thank you. Yes, I can be, my mom would say I can be a real pain in the ass. So that's my charge here in Washington, D.C., is to make sure that people are being fought for. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and just getting started with, and just thinking about the questions and reading through people's stories and experiences, I wanted to start really basic and have you describe what is grief.
I love that people think that that's a basic question, right? Like, this happens a lot where people, I do an interview and people are like, tell me what grief is. And that's like trying to define what love is, right? Because grief is part of love, and it's really hard to pin love down to one single definition. So that's my caveat, right? Like, you can't really define what grief is, but very, very broadly speaking, grief is a collection of emotional, physical, and relational responses to loss of any kind. It doesn't just belong to death. It doesn't just belong to the things that we normally think of as acceptable grief. You can have grief for the state of the world. You can have grief over the death of an animal. You can have grief over not getting a job that you wanted, right? I think it's important to understand that human existence is relational. And when things aren't unfolding in the ways that we want them to, we're going to have an emotional response to that. And grief is sort of the big umbrella term that applies to that emotional and physical response to life not being the way that we long for it to be.
And why do you think it's so hard for other people to understand?
To understand grief in general?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're kind of screwed in a way, because so much of our pop culture, so much of our media, so much of like the pop psychology articles tell us to look on the bright side. We've really been sold this idea that happiness is the same as being healthy. So from that really base level, I think grief is really hard to understand if you're experiencing it, but also it's really hard to understand if you're witnessing somebody else experiencing grief, because we've all been swimming in that sea of happiness is healthy. And I think that's a pretty subconscious message, that anything that isn't positive, grateful, happy, excited to be here is somehow wrong, right? So we're already going to run into translation errors, right? If you see a friend and they're having a hard time, if you have really absorbed that cultural message that is so deeply entrenched in this culture, if you've absorbed that message, you think your job is to make them feel better, to bring them back to that happy state of mind. And just from the get-go, we're not speaking the same language, right?
Right.
So I think it's really hard for people, even with the best of intentions, to realize that the foundation they're standing on when they see somebody they care about grieving any kind of loss or hardship, you have to be able to recognize that everything that you've learned is wrong, and your interpretation of what the problem is probably not the most helpful orientation. So I think it's just really hard for us to know that there is something to understand about grief, that it isn't a problem that needs to be solved, that your job is not to make it better for somebody. I think that's honestly the biggest hardship in understanding grief, is understanding that the ways that we have historically thought about it are not doing us any favors.
It reminds me of the short animated video, which I just think is so brilliantly done. And that's why it's been viewed 70 million times, because it's to be present and to sit with someone. And you do such a great job, I think, in that video of really helping guide people on how to just be there and not trying to solve grief. A number of people are having trouble finding good grief therapists. And there were so many questions about that. And the first question I want to ask you is, why are good grief therapists so hard to find?
Yeah, it is absolutely an issue. I think that good grief therapists are hard to find. It's related to what I just said, right? We have a culture and a medical industry and a clinical industry that sees grief as a problem to be solved, right? It's a deviation from normal, happy, healthy life. So in a lot of ways, we are training therapists to solve your grief for you, right? This is why you might go to your primary care physician after your sister dies, and within 10 minutes, they're trying to give you a prescription for antidepressants. You're like, I'm not depressed. My sister just died, right? There is so much misinformation at the training level for clinicians and medical providers. A lot of the new pathology-based diagnoses with prolonged grief disorder, like it's just doubling down on somebody's sad, you need to get them out of that shit, right? Sorry, I forgot to ask if I could swear or not, but sometimes it happens anyway.
It's okay.
But that is one of the big reasons why it is so difficult to find a truly grief-informed provider, is because from the very start of their training, they're being told that there's something wrong with grief, right? So you've got that double whammy of living in a culture that has been taught that happiness is the best thing. And then you've got a clinical training process that also says, hey, you got to get people out of this feeling as soon as possible. That is starting to change. It is starting to change. I think I have an advantage here because I have a 20-year long view of this.
Yeah. And
I can tell you that 13 years ago when Matt died, there was no such thing as grief literacy, right? There were some very lonely pioneers way back in that day who were talking in better ways about grief, but it was really, really awful. It is still bad out there, but it's not as bad as it was. So I can see a change starting to happen where you've got a better chance of finding somebody who doesn't have that unfortunately toxic and misguided view on grief. But I just want to acknowledge that for everybody. If you're having a hard time finding a grief therapist, you're not doing it wrong. They are still very hard to find.
And I was really so thrilled to see that you're just now offering some clinician training right now around, and I think that that's really important because I know sometimes therapists, they want to work with the clients that they've been with for a long time. They don't know how. And I thought, with you offering this training, it is such a great opportunity. You've educated the masses in grief, and now really working at the workforce level to enhance the literacy.
Yeah. So the training that Joelle is talking about, everybody, is the current 6-month training program. We just got started last week, and it's a start, right? To start really putting the skills and the mindset behind that desire that so many people have to do better at working with grieving people. I love that you started there, Joelle, that so many people know that they don't know how to support people really well. And that desire to learn better and do better, I love that. And I really do think that so many people, clinicians, the medical industry is a little bit slower, but certainly clinicians and a lot of hospice workers and a lot of social workers in the medical care system, they know that they've inherited systems that will not help them deliver the care and support that they want to. So that is where this training comes in, and other training programs that I have in my brain and that Joelle and I are talking about, because I want to give those people the skills that they need so that they can feel like they're being more effective and more supportive. At the same time, though, even when I'm focusing on helping clinicians and providers get better, I've got individual grieving people in mind. I don't want it to be hard for you to find the support you deserve. Like, those are heartbreaking messages that I get and that my team gets. Every single day, there's somebody messaging or leaving a comment on social media and saying, I went to my therapist for help after my baby died, and they told me that I just needed to practice gratitude or positive psychology, and I'm never going to a therapist again, right? Like, one bad interaction with a provider can sour a person from ever bothering to try again. And that means that you're losing out on support that you deserve. I don't want that for you. I want there to be skilled hands and bodies and hearts and minds underneath you so that you can do whatever you need to do. And that means, Joelle, focusing on policy to make your systems around your workplace support you in the ways that you need. It means me looking at training medical providers and clinical providers to get better so that when you do go to get regular support, those people have those skills, right? This is why we do social media stuff, so that you know that whatever you're feeling inside your loss, you're doing it right. Right? Yeah.
When is it time to leave a therapist?
That's a great question. When is it time to leave a therapist? Well, full stop. If you feel like they're being abusive or cruel or mean, stop. Right? This is true for any relationship across the board, right? Therapists, friends, anybody. If you feel like they're being abusive, or certainly if you're in danger, or you just feel like crap every time you see them, don't go back. Don't go back to somebody who makes you feel crappy. And I think there's a really interesting thing that happens here, is that I think that sometimes we want so badly for the person to get it that we keep going, hoping that this time they'll get it. If I just describe it correctly, if I just help them understand what I'm talking about, if I just help them understand me, they'll be a bigger support to me. If you're doing those kinds of mental gymnastics, that's not the right therapist for you. If you spend more of your time educating your therapist or your doctor on the realities of grief, that's not the right therapist for you. I don't mean that if you give it one shot, then that's it, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, especially if you've been working with somebody for a while and you've had a good relationship, and now this loss happened and your existing therapist is like, cheer up, I guess, right? It's okay for you to say, I'm not surprised that you're not sure how to deal with this, but like, I'd love to tell you what this is actually like for me. And these are the things that I can need help with. Sidebar, I hate that you need to do that much work to advocate for your needs. But as we were just saying a minute ago, a lot of therapists want to be truly helpful and supportive. They're just not exactly sure which things need support and which things need sort of that problem-solving approach. There are some issues inside grief that really benefit from that problem-solving approach, which we can get to in a minute. But so I think those are my top 3 things. One, any case of like abuse, or you feel like they're belittling you, or just me, out of there. No more chances, right? Second thing, if you feel like you've gone in and you've said, that sort of approach was helpful when I was trying to figure out what job I wanted to do next, but that's not helpful right now. Can we talk about some things that I could really use help with, right? If they come back with kind of doubling down, no, see, like, you've been sad for 15 minutes longer than I've allowed you to be sad for. So like, then out of there, right? But it is okay to say, these approaches aren't working. Can we talk about the things that would be really helpful to me? Right? It's okay to say that. If they can't meet you there, then yeah, you want to start shopping for somebody else.
This is, just so incredibly helpful. It also strikes me that for some people, the lack of communication and explanation may be happening within the household or within their friends, and how to begin those conversations, or how to have those conversations when you and another person that you care about, or who is significant in your life, seem far apart, and how to begin to close that gap for both of you. Do you have do you have suggestions or
I always have suggestions. I always got something to say about everything. Anyway, so your question here is, let's say that you've got a friend who really wants to be helpful, but they're not really being very helpful. What do you do? Yeah. Is that the question?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Or friend or husband or
somebody close.
Daughter.
Let's stick with somebody close for the let's stick with somebody close for the moment. So again, if they are abusive, belittling, whatever, there's a different response to this. So what I'm about to say here is for somebody with whom you feel safe and it's appropriate and safe to have a conversation like this, right? So you can say something like, I'm going to give you two scenarios, right? So one is they just said something like you mentioned that, this is your first holiday season without your dad and you're just having a really hard time. And your friend says, he wouldn't want you to be sad. He loved the holiday. Maybe you should have a party. Right?
Yeah.
So in the moment, you can say, I know that you're trying to be supportive, but that actually doesn't feel very good. Right? You can say it in the moment. You don't have to be like, ah! You can say, I know you're trying to be helpful. That one doesn't feel helpful. Can we talk about that? Or, I'd really love to just be sad with you. Can you do that with me? Right? Remember that your friends or your partner or whomever, they're all part of that grief. Illiterate is kind of a strong word in this case, but like grief phobic, learned the wrong things about grief culture. They're not usually misunderstanding you because they want to be jerks. Remember, I said, this isn't a conversation you have with a jerk. People want to be helpful. They're doing the things that they've been taught to do, right? You coming back and saying, that actually doesn't feel very good. Can we maybe do this instead? You can correct and redirect in the moment, right? These are basic communication skills, right? You can say, I understand where you're going. Can we talk about something that would feel better? What will very often happen, maybe not very often, maybe that's pessimistic of me. What might happen is that somebody's like, I was only trying to help, right? Because nobody likes to be told that they're doing something wrong, right? But if they don't hear that what they're doing or saying is not helpful, then they're just going to keep doing it. And everybody loses in that situation. The grieving person doesn't get the support they deserve, and the person trying to help doesn't get to deliver the love that they're trying to deliver, right? So you can say, these things aren't helpful. Here's what I'd love to see instead. If the person gets kind of huffy and says like, I was only trying to help, you can be like, I get that. Maybe we can talk about it later. And then you change the subject, right? This is classic couples counseling here, is when people are getting too emotional or too like uncomfortable or irritated, it's really hard to have a calm conversation. So option 2 here is not when somebody says something, but later, once you've had a chance to sort of calm down and not feel so hurt or upset or angry about it, you can go to that person and say, this has been a really hard season for me. And I've noticed that a lot of people are trying to help me feel better in ways that don't help. Would you be willing to talk with me about the things that I actually need from you that would feel supportive, right? So you can go to a person and invite them into a conversation about what would truly feel supportive to you and start there, right? Those are process conversations. I talk about this a lot in the monthly Q&A that I do with my Patreon friends. The process conversation is a therapy term too, where you talk about how you talk about things, right? So if Joelle was constantly interrupting me here, which she is not, but if she was constantly interrupting me, I might take a step back and say, can we talk about how we're doing this conversation? Because I've noticed that every time I start speaking, you interrupt me, and that makes it hard for me to talk. Can we talk about sort of the ground rules of how we're going to do an interview, right? So that process conversation that you might have with a friend or your partner or your family member would be to say, can we talk about how this is going? Can we talk about what I see happening whenever I say I miss my dad and you come in and tell me that he wouldn't want me to be sad? Can we talk about what that feels like to me? Right? These are really high level relational communication skills. It is very hard to access them when you're in pain. Right? So the last thing that I want to say about this, I started out saying, don't have those kinds of conversations with people who can't hear it. The image that I like to use here is like, if you're out of milk, don't go to the furniture store looking for milk, right? Don't have a conversation about what you need to feel supported with somebody who is incapable of hearing you. Don't go to your racist, cranky Aunt Sue to talk about your grief and what you need from them if they're just going to attack you or gaslight you or tell you, like, double down on it's not that bad. For relationships like that, it's like you want to win the argument by putting on your hat. Somebody used to tell me, but like, that's a really interesting opinion. That's not something that I want to talk about right now. I would love to talk about something else, right? You don't have to do a relational intervention to talk about what somebody's crappy support feels like to you if that's not going to move things forward, right? You also don't have to sit there and take it either. That's what I mean by winning an argument by putting your hat on and leaving the room, right? That's not a way that I'm going to be talked to right now. I would be happy to talk about something else. If you continue to bring this up, I'm going to go. And then you go, right? So big, long ramble about the 3 different things to remember. 1, you don't have to have these conversations about what you need with somebody who is going to be inappropriate or cruel. 2, you can have a response in the moment to somebody that you trust, right? If Joyelle said something that didn't feel supportive to me right now, I would probably say, yo, that's not helpful, right? So in the moment. And 2, the process conversation after the fact, when you pick a non-emotional, non-stressful time to come back and say, here's something that I noticed. Can we talk about it together? Right? 3 options for dealing with less than stellar support.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I was really struck in reading through the questions on how many people were describing losses, and they varied in different relationships, but I would characterize the relationship as an anchor relationship. I mean, very important to this individual and their well-being and stability. Do you have strategies or do you have advice for people who are either in the anticipatory grief phase where they know, maybe a terminal illness or death is coming, and then also are there strategies or advice for people after the death has occurred? And again, I mean, these are really in the articulation of the questions that people were offering to us. I mean, very deep, very significant relationships for these individuals. And I don't want to project or put words in anyone's mouth, but almost a sense of like, where are the walls, and trying to find, now how do I put my sneakers back on and, begin to stand up? Do you have any sort of advice for those types of losses?
Yeah. Okay. So if I understand what you're saying, we're talking about sort of the spectrum of relationships and losses, right? Those kinds of distinctions can get really messy really quickly if we start talking about hierarchy of grief. So I love what you just said about an anchor relationship, right? Because an anchor relationship is just one of those, this person is my world kind of things, or this animal is my world, if that's the loss you're carrying in today. And I think the thing that I love about that the most is that, like, everybody gets to decide who or what their anchor is, right? There's one the top negative review on Amazon of It's Okay That You're Not Okay is wrong, but it says like, she says that the death of a grandparent is nothing. I'm like, okay, one, never say that. I've never said that.
Right.
But for what that person says in that comment is like, my grandmother raised me. She was more than a parent to me. Do you know what I mean? And like,
right.
We don't know the depth of a relationship from the outside. So those categories of grandparent, best friend, sister, dog, like you don't know the weight of that being's presence in the grieving person's life, which is why I say that curiosity is always the best place from which to approach a grieving person, right? Without your assumptions about what a relationship meant or what it means to them now, or what it means for that person to live without that being in their lives, right? So everybody gets to define their anchors for themselves. Now, the other thing that you described is like, I'm going to go back to grandparents here for a second. When I was in my teens, my grandparents died, and that their losses did not impact my daily life in any way. It's not that I didn't love my grandparents, but they were not part of my life. And their losses made sense to me in a way, right? If you're carrying the loss of a grandparent, that is in no way to say that that is a lesser loss. We're talking about anchor relationships here. When Matt died, that made the entire world dissolve. It made no sense to me. He was my partner and my best friend and the one who got up and walked the dog in the morning. Like so much, I'm going to rephrase that. I was going to say so much of my life was impacted. There was no part of my life that was not impacted by his sudden death. So if we take those two things next to each other, the loss of my grandparents when I was a teenager was sad, mostly because I could see my parents being sad, but also the impact on my daily life and my worldview and my sense of who I was and what I was here for, barely a ripple. Matt's death, there was nothing left of the world, right? I want to go back to anchor relationships. It doesn't have to be a partner for your world to dissolve. You get to define those world-defining losses for yourself. So to go to what I think is like part 2 of your question is, what the hell do you do when an anchor person or being dies? Because I think, again, going back to that sort of grief averse, poorly trained people around grief is like, we want to believe that you're okay, that there is a simple set of things to do to make you fine. Like people don't see that your world is gone because their worlds are not gone. I think that's one of the big chasms for grieving people and for support people. Like if you don't realize that you live in 2 very different worlds, then you're always going to miss each other, right? So if you're the one whose world has disappeared, I really like the idea of like shrinking down what survival looks like right now. I love that you started, Joyelle, with like, how do I put on my sneakers? Putting on your sneakers is a massive step when your world just dissolved. Like, if those knots are done incorrectly or you can't get the thing loose enough to put, like, that's it, you're done for the day. Right? Frustration with getting your sneakers on can make you done for the day. And I think that normalizing that, right? Shrinking what a good day or what a day of survival or a minute of survival looks like. It's not that it's going to make any of that easier. It's that it can make it more gentle. Right? And I think like changing your horizon line, I think it's so tempting when your world has evaporated to spool out into the future of how am I going to live this? How am I going to survive this? How am I going to get through this and this and this and this and this? And you want to pull that time horizon back as close to you as you can in this moment. What is going to help me survive this minute? What would feel good? Good is relative. What would feel supportive or comforting to me right now? What do I need in this moment to get me through? Right? I think when you can shrink your horizon event or your event horizon, when you can cook that back to right now in this moment, what do I need? Right? It's when we start to try to absorb the enormity of surviving this. That's I think that what pushes a lot of people over the edge, right? You can't take in the enormity of having to live this for the rest of your life. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
the
I think
enormity
also,
of living it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, the last thing that I want to say about this before we go on to the next thing is just that acknowledgement that your world as you know it, as you knew it, has disappeared. That's really powerful medicine, right? Because you've got everybody from the outside and the pop psychology articles telling you that you can come back bigger and stronger and really understand what's important. And you've got all of this stuff bombarding you that you're going to be okay. So to tell yourself the truth, I don't know how I'm going to survive this, and everything is different now. Just telling yourself that truth makes things different, right? We don't lie to ourselves very well. And I think this is also one of the reasons that all of that not helpful support feels so physically and physiologically grating, is because it's a lie, right? And if you can find places to tell yourself the truth, it's not going to change anything, but it can make everything more gentle. I want to jump into anticipatory grief just for a second. I have a number of friends in my life right now who are living that reality, like no idea how much longer their people have. And I hold back in those situations. If they ask me what grief will be like, I'll talk to them about it, obviously, but I'm not courting those conversations, because I think if I told my friends what it would be like after their person died, one, I don't know, but two, you can't prepare for that, right? You can't prepare for the reality of grief. It's not a test you can study for, I think, is the thing. I think something that can be really powerful during that end of life process is to there's an image in the journal, in the How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed journal. It's one of my favorites, of like a person going across a bridge, right? And that one of the main things that happens, especially in those early days and weeks and months and years of grief, is going back and forth over the bridge between what your life was and what it is now, and wondering which parts of the before life belong or deserve to be in the now life. And I think something you can do during that transition process, that end of life process, is leave yourself some messages for later you, right? Make yourself some care packages or some messages or some things that you want to remember for later you. I say this to one of my friends a bunch because there's, it's a really complex medical situation. And one of the things that I keep telling her is, when he dies, you're going to second guess every decision you ever made. And you're going to forget that you made the best decisions you possibly could, given the information at this time, right? If you can leave your future self some messages to say, here's what I was thinking and here's what I was trying, and I know that I'm going to question it. I already feel like I'm questioning it, right? It's like you're doing your future, you're leaving some messages in a bottle for your future self, right? It's not going to make it suck less, but I think it can build in some continuity between the life of before and the life of after. And sometimes just that thread gives you something to hold on to. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I was just, in reading the experiences and sort of the internal flood of emotions that people are trying to cope with at the same time, and then they're having interactions with other people that are compounding the experience. One of the questions as I was reading through the experiences is how to set boundaries. So you're in a very tender place yourself. And people around you, they're not grief literate, or they're well intended, but it comes off poorly. How any advice on when or how to set those boundaries around, and that frankly, giving yourself permission to do that.
Yeah.
And I was feeling for people in reading this, and I wonder what kind of advice you might have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boundaries for everyone all the time. I read something on Instagram the other day, or maybe it was on Twitter, that we think that being vulnerable means we shouldn't have any boundaries, right? Like if you really want to connect with people, you shouldn't have any boundaries. Like that is trash, right? The person posting it was saying this is trash, not saying that that's a true thing. But boundaries, you can't be vulnerable without boundaries, right? Boundaries are safety, right? Boundaries are like, if I'm just about to go into a training pitch thing and Joyelle's having a really rough time and she messages me as a support, a boundary is for me to say, I love you so much. I'm about to enter a conversation. I can't have this discussion with you right now. That's a boundary, right? That lets Joyelle know that I see her, I hear her, I understand that she's in pain right now, and I'm not ignoring her. I need to focus on something else and I will be back, right? Boundaries are a communication of what you're available for, what's working and what's not working. And boundaries are also about, this is how I'll be treated. And if this isn't how I'm treated, here's what you can expect to have happen, right? So boundaries and consequences. Boundaries are really about safety. Remember I said earlier, like, if you're looking for milk, don't go to the furniture store, right? That's another thing about boundaries. We have to tell people what our boundaries are in different ways. Otherwise, they will walk all over us. And that's not people being jerks. That's just like, we don't know a boundary is there unless we're told that there's one. I want to say here before I go into my glorious rant about boundaries, it sucks that you have to do it, right? You shouldn't have to find the energy to tell somebody, giving you details of the last 5 minutes of my sister's life is not something that I'm comfortable doing. Like, you shouldn't have to do that stuff. And you do have to do that stuff, right? Because we do have a grief illiterate culture, because people do think that the best way to be supportive is to cheer you up or make you not feel so bad. It's just like, I wish you didn't have to, and you do, right? So what we talked about earlier with, I don't even remember what we were talking about. We were talking about boundaries though, with like, here are some things that you can say to people, right? I want to give you an example from my own life, because I think that'll make it more clear. Just because somebody is kind enough or thoughtful enough to ask does not mean you have to answer. So here's an example of this. Being relatively new here to Los Angeles, I meet a lot of new people. And if they ask me what I do for work, then suddenly we're talking about grief and every sad thing that's ever happened to them. And I was having a conversation with somebody, and he asked me how I got into this work. And I have a speech that I do when somebody asks that is enough information to tell people what happened, but not anything actually personal, right? It's like the safe for public consumption story of why I do this work. And they were very curious, and they started asking more questions, and they started asking me what actually happened to Matt in the water that day. And I like feel my hackles go up, like, who the hell do you think you are that you are privileged for that, like, blow by blow? Now I know my responses well enough that I was like, oh yeah, don't rip this person's head off. Don't rip this person's head off. And I went into my very well rehearsed response, which is, those are not details that I share publicly, right? It is okay to tell somebody, those aren't details I'm comfortable sharing. That's not a topic that I'm willing to discuss right now, right? This conversation is bringing up some stuff for me, and I need to stop having this conversation right now, right? It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. It can be the same statement that you use over and over again. I use that, those aren't details I'm comfortable sharing. a million times, right? Just because somebody is curious or is kind enough or thoughtful enough to ask, if you don't want to answer, you do not have to. And it doesn't have to be because they did the wrong thing or whatever. You can just say, that's not something I'm comfortable discussing. Now, sometimes people will push, right? But you need to talk about this. Open up to me. Like, if you're going to go open up to me, I'm never telling you anything. But you don't have to defend your boundaries. You don't have to explain the reasons behind your boundaries. Your boundaries are your boundaries. It is probably going to feel weird and uncomfortable to share a boundary because we don't usually do that, right? We're conditioned to be polite. And if somebody asks, I have to answer them, right? If somebody wants to talk about this, I guess I have to talk about this. No, right? Boundaries are the way that you keep yourself safe and you take care of yourself. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable stating a boundary, then I think you're doing it right because you're breaking out of a habit of not putting up a boundary. So a little bit of discomfort is a good sign that you are being clear. It's also very, very tempting to defend your boundaries. And I said this a second ago, but you don't have to defend anything. Nobody has to agree with your boundaries, but they do need to abide by them. They don't have to think you're right. They just need to abide by your boundaries. And we can't really have a conversation about boundaries without having a conversation about consequences, right? If you continue to tell me that I need to get married again, I'm going to end the call. If you continue to keep asking me about something that I've already said I'm not comfortable discussing, I'm not going to show up at your house anymore, right? Here's the boundary. Here are the consequences for ignoring the boundary. You don't even need to come up with a new way of saying it every time. You can be a broken record because honestly, why give more effort to somebody who's not listening?
Absolutely.
Right? Yay, boundaries. And you can use those process conversations that we talked about earlier. Let's say that Joelle wants all of my personal details for some report that she's going to do, and I'm not comfortable sharing that information. I'm going to have a process conversation about Joelle would never do that, people, but I'm just using her as an example because she's here, right? But we're going to have a process conversation about, I had said I wasn't comfortable sharing that, but you asked me again. Can we talk about what we do when we hear like a boundary from each other? With people you really trust, you can have those conversations. You were asking me a lot of questions the other day and I told you I wasn't comfortable and you kept doing it. Can we talk about how we have those conversations, right? Remember that those are high-level communication, relational skills. You don't always have the bandwidth to do it. But sometimes with the right relationships, with people with whom you feel safe, it's important to have those conversations because it gets both of you closer to the kind of connection and support that you both want, right? But none of that can happen without boundaries.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at the time. I want to ask, you've been again, you were here and working on the grief field a decade ago, as was I. And I think the field's evolved pretty substantially, and it's continuing to evolve. And what is your perspective? How has your view on the field and the advancement shifted over time? And where do you think we need to go?
Yeah. I love this one because it's still really bad out there and it's easy to be frustrated with it. I mean, I think Micah and I have this conversation a lot because we get a lot of comments and direct messages on social and a lot of emails and things. And I feel like I've built this little bubble of colleagues in my world who do really beautiful and useful work in the grief industry or the grief field. And then, we get all of these messages from folks and it's like reports from the field on how bad it is out there. And it's interesting because I get to see both sides of it. I get to see the truly, truly amazing work that still a small handful of people are doing and the progress that's been made. And I get to see things like, if some celebrity posts something that is grief phobic or accidentally grief shaming, and to see the comments underneath those posts of people coming in and saying, hey, that's actually not that helpful. Here's the message that's actually sending. I'm always like, yes, right. You've all learned. I love it. So there really is evidence of change, and it makes me really, really happy. And at the same time, I do see so much evidence of nothing has changed. Right? Every time one of you messages me or my team and says, I went to my doctor and they told me that I needed to schedule my sadness over my dead child to no more than an hour a week, I'm like, nothing has gotten better. Right? But having that long view, I think even knowing everything that I know and hearing how awful it is out there for so many people, I actually do feel hopeful about what's already changed just in the last 5 years, and how many providers and well-meaning friends want to do better. Like, it may not necessarily be trickling down to individual grievers as a large group, but honestly, so much. So Matt died, as we're talking now, Matt died 13 years ago this summer. And just 13 years ago, these conversations weren't happening. There was nothing out there. There was one lone person who started an organization that is now called Soaring Spirits Lost Foundation, which is a lot of S's and hard for me to say. But that was the only, her early thing was called, Widow's Voice. It was the only thing on the entire internet, after being a very good researcher and looking forever. That one blog was the only thing that I could find that even remotely sounded like me. And that was just 13 years ago. There is so much that's happened in those last 13 years. And when my agent and I were shopping the proposal for It's Okay That You're Not Okay around to the big publishing houses. Now, this was just, what year are we in?
2022.
I know, I was doing math. Math always takes me a minute. Joelle makes fun of me because I don't math, and she does. 7 years ago. 7 years ago?
True.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. 7 or 8 years ago,
matter.
whatever the heck it was. It's Okay came out in 2017, and we were going to publishers in 2015 and the beginning of 2016. Back then, all of the big publishing houses were saying, like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We really need to be talking about this, but nobody's interested in books on grief, so we pass. Right? Back then, trying to get articles published on the realities of grief had media outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post saying, like, nobody wants to talk about grief. And my response was always like, yeah, nobody wants to talk about it if you're going to talk about it as a series of steps that people need to work through to get back to being happy, productive little capitalists. Like, nobody wants to talk about it if you talk about it in that reductive, here's 4 easy steps to get over anything that hurts. Like, nobody wants to talk about it. But if you talk about it as a real thing that happens, that deserves love and care, if you let people tell the truth about their experience, everybody will want to talk about it. And just in that last 7 years, from trying to shop It's Okay to publishing houses who were like, nobody wants it, to now, I mean, there are articles about the realities of grief all the time now, right? There are conversations happening about what it's really like to lose your person or your health, right? The fact that there are so many conversations happening about what grief is really like and what true support really is, that is a revolution. It did not exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It certainly didn't exist 50 years ago. Sometimes when I talk about the stages model, people slide into my DMs yelling at me that I'm like dissing Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Like, in her time, she was absolutely revolutionary in the ways that she talked about the end of life process and dying. There hadn't been a change in that sort of, here's a little bit with that we maybe know about grief. Like, there hadn't been a change in the ways that we had thought about grief at all after that sort of weird co-opting of her work, which was never meant for grief, but that's a whole other subject. Like, what she did rammed the gates of the culture to get people talking about the realities of the dying process. And in a lot of ways, it prepared us to be ready to talk about even harder things, how to survive after your person dies, right? We are so ready for a revolution in how we talk about this stuff. And I can gush about this stuff forever because I am really excited about it, but so much has changed in 50 years, in 10 years, in 5 years. It's getting so much better. It is not good yet. It is not good yet. There's so much more work to do. And the more people tell the truth about what living with grief is like, the more people who are willing to have these hard conversations with the well-meaning supporters around them about what does and doesn't help, the more people who are willing to stand up for themselves and give a boundary and pay attention to caring for themselves in the way that they need to, the more the culture changes, right? We need to see other people telling the truth about their own experience in order to feel brave enough to tell the truth about our own lives. And as we do that, that force, that somebody told me I use so many military metaphors for somebody who is not in the military, but that army of people being willing to talk about how hard it is to be here sometimes and what we truly need to survive these impossible times, the more likely it is that we're going to get that world that we all want, where there is enough love and support to go around no matter what happens. Yeah.
Megan, I want to make sure that people know where to find you. So we're going to drop some things in the chat on certainly on where to connect with you. But I also want to give you a moment to say where you often connect with people. It's on social, I'm guessing, and on your podcast.
Yes. So first thing I want to mention is the podcast Hereafter with Megan Devine. That is me. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. This season has some really amazing guests in it, like people that are just so amazing to talk to. But it really is about finding ways to survive whatever is asked of you. This season's theme is about hope. And if you know me, you know I have some issues with that, with the word hope, but it's a really amazing podcast with some really cool guests. So Hereafter with Megan Devine, wherever you get podcasts. You can find Refuge in Grief on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. That is a fantastic community if you're carrying any kind of loss, or if you want to learn how to be a better supporter. The posts there, the comment sections are amazing. Really, really good grief education right in there. Of course, the books, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, and How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed, the journal for grief. I love that journal. Patreon is a fantastic place to be. I think, honestly, like people are sleeping on the Patreon. So I have a Patreon, and once a month I do a live Q&A with my patrons, and it is way less expensive than like trying to find a therapist. It's not therapy, but like if you have questions that you want to ask me, you should really sign up and be a patron. December's Q&A happens tomorrow. Plenty of time for you to sign up there. And Joelle's going to put the link where you can sign up for that. But
we are.
If you want to spend time with me once a month with my face actually talking to you, Patreon is the thing to sign up for. And I think that's it. I mean, you can go to refugeingrief.com to find some other things. If you're looking for clinical trainings, check out megandevine.co. And there's a link there to a couple of like evergreen content things that you can download. The current clinical training is underway, so no more registrations for that one, but that will happen again sometime mid next year.
That's very exciting. So last question that we ask our guests is, if we were stranded on an island, with a group of individuals, what would you find yourself naturally doing for the community?
Oh,
and what music would you be listening to while you did it?
I would probably be cooking. Mm-hmm. I would probably
what type of food?
What type? Well, what island are we on? Help me out here.
So anything.
well, it depends. It depends, because did we arrive with ingredients? Then like, I'm just going to deal with that. If we
you're
have
making
to
this too
forage,
complicated.
if we have to forage, I'm super into that. So yeah, like I would be doing on the care and sustenance thing. And what music would I be listening to? Honestly, nothing. Because in my island, there's amazing bird songs and bird calls, and probably some monkeys. And I want to hear that. I don't want to hear your beatbox. I want to hear the birds. So that's what's happening in my island.
That's wonderful. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I'll just thank you so much for being here with us today. And thanks for everyone who came. And we're going to be meeting again on January 11th at 2 p.m. with an FMLA expert to talk about bereavement leave and what your rights are with employers when a death event occurs. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Megan. Have a wonderful end of the year, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, babe.
All right. Bye.
Bye, friends.